Jerk here with Dynasty Owner, bringing you another Free Agent Friday. Today we're going to jump straight into it. We have quite a few players to talk about today, at least a lot more than we had last week. So today we're going to be talking about the AFC East. And first up is the Buffalo Bills. So we have two players to talk about. One is 34 years old, and one is 26 years old. Both unrestricted free agents, and they are Emmanuel Sanders and Matt Breida. So I don't know, kind of both of these players are a little bit dull to talk about. I hate to put it that way, but it's really that all the Bills had for free agents. Sanders obviously aging. He's 34 years old, backside of his career, no doubt about that. He was inconsistent in 2021, really wasn't able to be trusted from a dynasty owner's standpoint. So he's going to look to get a salary close to what he had last year. So that's looking at about $6 million a year. And that's really the going rate for these aging wide receivers, especially once you start to get over 32, 33 years old. Think A.J. Green, think Emmanuel Sanders last year. So these players kind of right at their market value where they're going, about $6 million. We have Matt Breida also to talk about, as I mentioned. So he was a fringe player to talk about, but he's owned in 75% of Dynasty Owner League, so it makes sense that we talk about him just from the sheer fact that, a lot of you deem it necessary to own him. So he isn't really a startable asset. He isn't really even a player that you can put on your bench most weeks in Dynasty Owner League. He just didn't have enough volume, enough production. But he's cheap enough where he should be rostered in most leagues. So let's see what he made last year. He was right at a little bit over $1 million. He's going to make about $1 million on his next contract per year. So he's still rosterable. He should be owned in at least 75% of leagues like he is now, but you're not going to be able to expect much from him unless you have, a player going down in front of him, maybe even two players going down in front of him, depending on which team he lands on. And that's kind of up in the air. I really don't even have a guess on where he could land. He's been journeyman running back pretty much his whole career, so I don't even have a good guess on where he could land. We have New England Patriots up next. So three players. We have James White, Brandon Bolden, Jacoby Myers. Three pretty interesting players to talk about. So James White, interesting to talk about just because he's been perennially this undervalued player. Really the past 5 years, as far as I can remember, he's always been undervalued. And 2021 looked to be much of the same until he was injured. So he got injured in week 3, out for the season. I know it's a small sample size, but in those 2 weeks that he played, he averaged 15.3 fantasy points. So very healthy. He was on pace to, be another undervalued player like usual. I think that White's going to return to New England. So he's played every snap of his entire career with New England. He's got a great role. I think he'll have a great role for himself in 2022. Given his age, it's likely he's probably going to sign another 1-year deal, maybe 2 years. But if I had to put money on it, I'd say one-year deal. And then it's probably going to earn him about $2 million. So he was right at about $2.5 million on his last contract. He'll make about $2 million this year, just the fact that he's aging a little bit. And obviously the injury, that's not going to help his chances at making more money. So expect very little change from White's contract. Should definitely be owned at 100% of leagues. Brandon Bolden is another interesting one. So he's 32 years old, just turned 32, but I would consider it a young 32. So he's only had 383 touches in his 10-year career. And if you remember, he actually opted out of the 2020 NFL season due to COVID. So all this to say that he has very minimal wear, at least real game time wear on his body for his entire career. So Bolden took over for the injured James White in 2021. Didn't really take over that entire role, but he took over the majority of it. He was likely not an effective or as efficient as White would have been, if he'd have been in the lineup all year. But he provided owners a fine fantasy season. He was top 50 for Dynasty fantasy points, so a good value at least for you. And he was startable in some games. So I look for him to make right at about $1.5 million for the next year. And like I said, he's 32 years old, so he's getting pretty far up there for running back age. And finally, Jacoby Myers, very healthy season, 186 fantasy points. I actually owned him in one of my Dynasty Owner leagues. I think it was the league I finished second or third in. And he was a great bench player for me. I loved having him. I think he slid into my starting lineup a few times because of the bye weeks. So his salary was right at the league minimum, $588,000. He finished as wide receiver 2 for Dynasty Dollar for fantasy points. So very efficient wide receiver, almost finished as that number 1 wide receiver that you're looking for value. But he's also a restricted free agent. So I wrote about this in my article. I wrote about it last year in a few of my articles. So I'm not going to read the whole quote, but go to my article. It's got a good quote on what restricted free agents mean compared to unrestricted free agents. And I'm going to do a full article on this in the coming weeks about breaking down all the different types of free agents and what that means. Really, it just means that it's a little more complicated of a process for him. It's good things for him just because he's got a little more options as far as teams wanting to sign him as opposed to just, being stuck on a single team as opposed to some other free agents that don't have that. But he's also not an unrestricted free agent where he can just pretty much decide wherever he wants to go. So go and read the article. I think I break it down pretty good so you can understand it. Either way, Myers fits the description. He's a restricted free agent. He has 3 years of service in the NFL, which is what that term designates. So he's going to make between about $5 and $6 million per year, and he's earned that with a very solid year that he had last year. Miami Dolphins. There are 6 Miami Dolphins, so quite a few. I'm not going to talk about all of them today. I will talk about all of them at some point, just not right now. So first one we want to talk about is Will Fuller. So Fuller is 27 years old, really a wasted season for him. I hate saying it like that, but he had only 4 receptions in 2021, and he made over $10 million. So that's more than $2.5 million per reception. I mean, good for him, but obviously, he was injured, and then just everything that he's gone through, it's not great from a team standpoint and from getting a new contract standpoint. I think Miami just wants to wash their hands of this deal, move on. Anyone that's looking to pick up Fuller, dynasty owner, you're probably going to be looking about $8 million, maybe even closer to that $10 million that he had last year. Philip Lindsay, not really much to talk about him, but we'll mention him. So he's owned in 74% dynasty owner leagues. He was largely forgotten about last season. I honestly kind of forgot about where he even ended up at the end of the season. So he was waived by the Texans in late November. Dolphins claimed him, gave him actually 3 games of pretty decent workload, 10 carries. He wasn't able to amass more than 42 yards in any of those games. So just not as efficient as you'd want him to be. And that's probably most of the reason why I kind of wrote him off, is just because you don't hear much about him, and try to stay up to date on a lot of these players. But Philip Lindsay's kind of the one that fell through the cracks and didn't really get much talking about him over the season. So he's slated to make about $3 million per year, close to what he made last year. So no real change for his contract. Finally, Mike Goseki, by far the most interesting Dolphin to talk about. He's earned himself a top-tier contract, especially with how he finished last season. Looks to be somewhere between right around $13 million. I'd say between 11 and 13 million per year. I also think there's a chance that the Dolphins use a franchise tag on him, which would be a little bit cheaper for them, I think, at least short term. So they put him on franchise tag this year. He's looking to make between 11 and 12 million dollars. So he's not going to be, pushing for that 14, 15 million dollar contract if they franchise him. But what it's kind of doing is just passing that buck down, to the next year, where he's gonna need a long-term contract at some point. And if they keep franchise tagging him, then it's going to be unaffordable. At some point they're going to have to pay him a real contract, or else these franchise tags, if they start to add up year after year, they're going to get more expensive. So finally, New York Jets, 3 to talk about: Jameson Crowder, Tevin Coleman, Braxton Barrios. Again, I know a lot of you are probably thinking, well, these aren't the top tier free agents we want to be talking about, but this is what each team has. So Jameson Crowder, really know what to say about him. He's wide receiver 68 last year. I think he's more of an effective real life wide receiver as opposed to a fantasy wide receiver, and you can probably say that about a lot of these players. But it's no wonder that he's only owned in 34% dynasty owner leagues. Previous salary $9.5 million. He barely got 200 fantasy points last year. Just not a recipe for success, especially value success. Just not what you're looking for. So what's even worse is that I anticipate his contract, believe it or not, is going to increase. So it won't be much. It'll be a slight increase, but he's probably going to go from about $9.5 million last year to closer to $10 million. So not a big increase, but I don't think it's going to decrease. If anything, maybe down to $8 million, but he's going to be in that $8 million to $10 million range. Probably not going to be affordable for you. Let's see how old he is. Yeah, he's 28. So maybe if he moves on from the Jets and finds a good number 2 spot on the team, but even then I'd be skeptical. So if I own him in any league, I'd be planning on dropping him as soon as he signs a new contract. Obviously, wait and see where that is, but I don't know. I'm a little bit pessimistic on his options looking forward. So Tevin Coleman, mostly non-factor, 2021. He's still owned in over 78% of leagues. That is not due to his production, though. That is solely due to his $1.1 million contract. People kind of just holding him, waiting and seeing what happens. It's a good strategy. I would hold him. And, if he was dropped in one of my leagues, I would definitely pick him up. So I have no problem with anybody continuing to roster him. I don't anticipate he's going to make anywhere over $1 million per year. So it's a good hold for now. And then, if you don't like where he lands, you can, just cut that contract for free. Finally, Braxton Barrios. He's seldom talked about, another forgotten player kind of. But yeah, actually had a decent return on investment for really the whole season. So he finished as wide receiver 48, which is a little bit better than I expected. You know, when I thought about Barrios and you think about where he finished, I wouldn't have guessed as high as 48. I'd probably guessed in the 60s somewhere. But more impressive is that he finished as wide receiver 6 in Dynasty Salary for Fantasy Point. And basically, it comes down to his salary. So $644,000 per year. Anytime you have that and you're a decent wide receiver, especially if you're going to be, you know, a top 50 wide receiver, you're gonna be in the top 10 for Dynasty Salary for Fantasy Point. It's just how it works out. So not really startable, I would say, in most leagues, but he was a good bench wide receiver for a lot of people. I would have loved to have him as my bench wide receiver in a couple of my leagues. So I expect his salary to increase by about tenfold. So he's going to be about $6 million per year, looking 2022. And good for him. You know, I mean, he earned it. He did what the Jets needed. He was kind of the go-to guy. A lot of the red zone opportunities. I'm happy for him. Like I said, I'm not sure he's going to be rosterable in most leagues with that increase, but you know, good for him, and good for the man himself. So that's all I want to talk about today. I appreciate everybody listening, taking the time to read, watch. Go ahead and follow us at Dynasty Owner on Twitter. Follow us, subscribe on YouTube at Dynasty Owner, and then also look for me on Twitter at Dynasty Jerk. Really helps us out, and I'm looking forward to bringing you all kinds of content throughout the off season. So I appreciate everybody listening. Take care and be safe.